Hello and welcome to this narrated PowerPoint on the making of America 1789 to 1900. Brief reminder as always of where this fits in. You can see there in the top right there the 5 main topics that we'll be covering, and you can see that USA, the making of America, fits in the part of paper 3. It's the second half of paper 3, worth 20% on its own. The paper itself was worth 40%, and it's coupled with living under Nazi rule. It actually follows a very similar, the same mark scheme as the crime and punishment mark scheme. So you get at the very beginning of the paper these single point questions, simple knowledge questions. You just need often just 1 word or 2 words to answer them. And then we have a organised account. As with crime and punishment, you really need to organise this carefully. You need to plan your answer. We have a question here on the impact of the Californian gold rush. It's going to be a focus. There's going to need a focus again on planning this answer. There's going to be multiple issues you're going to be talking about. You need to plan it well. Second order concept. So we're looking at complexity, that it's not as simple as one impact. There's multiple impacts and you might prioritize those impacts or show how that impact changed over time. And then we finish with the 2 essay style questions. You got a choice out of the 2 and you choose one of them. Again, absolutely vital that you take your time, you plan your answer, you leave enough time for it. It's a 2-sided argument, very short introduction to introduce it for the highest marks, and a complex conclusion which shows a sophisticated understanding. And again, we got that complex thinking here. On we go then with the actual content that we'll be covering. Just a little bit of background first of all. We've got to understand where America comes from, and you can understand an awful lot, I believe, about modern day America when you look at its history. So USA had declared its independence from Britain in 1776 with the phrase that all men are created equal, and that's a notion we're going to be investigating as we go through this PowerPoint and through this content. Is that true of the state that they created? Founding fathers drew up a constitution. Now they had a very deliberate balance of powers, and you can see it partly in that bottom right diagram there. So no power held total sway over, total control over any other. So we had Congress, President, Supreme Court. States had their own powers as well. And what we see over the history of America is a battle between centralized governmental power and the power of the states. And when we look at issues such as slavery and the treatment of slavery, that's one of the centralized issues there. Voting rights were to do with owning property. White males could vote. Indians, Native Americans, Indians were seen as nation states, so they could make treaties with them. And the vast majority of African Americans were actually living as slaves at this point. Now I'm just going to add to this 2 of the central ideas that I personally believe are important when understanding this. First of all, I believe America has been founded and is got a central tenet of survival of the fittest. That's what led them to break away from Britain. Then you're not going to tell us what to do. And the story of America, of migrants, of gold miners, of Native Americans, of slavery, is battling their way to the top, battling their way to have control over the other parties. And it's almost if it's out of us too, then I'm going to make sure I do everything I can to make sure that I'm the one who's on top. I'm the one who's in control, and that's very much linked, in my view, to the idea of capitalism, of money talks, of perhaps being willing to forget certain morals if the money is right, if there's an end goal. And also hand in hand with that is the idea that that people are expected to work hard, and if they've got money, that's because they've earned it. They've earned their rights. So that's a personal thing, but it's a theme that I think occurs throughout this history, and I would argue in modern day America. Tis only a personal view on this though. So first focus is growing pains, and we're going to see America's growth from those 13 initial colonies over to the west. So as I said, initially the British territories. The British lost the War of Independence. 230 million acres of Indian lands who had fought for the British were immediately handed over. Not many morals in that. We have the Northwest Territory up here, and then the Southwest Territory down here. Now, the Northwest Territory was won partly as a series of wars against the Native Americans, against the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville, which led to the new states of, let's see if we can find this, Ohio, just here, and Indiana to the west of it, and then we've got Illinois, and then we've got Michigan up here. And in the Southwest, immediately the frontiersmen had set up their farms in the areas of Kentucky, in Tennessee, in Mississippi, and in Alabama. So there we have the divide between the Northwest and the Southwest territories. Okay, initial gaining of the land. What we're going to see is slowly the Americans head westwards across this plains. First of all, they'll head directly for the direct West Plains, and then we're going to see this middle ground eaten up as well. But before we get there, first of all, Thomas Jefferson, third president, created many systems to try and sell as much land as possible. The idea was that small farmers could do it, but actually the $640 required to buy a section was actually most often swallowed up by land speculators who'd got capitalism at work. They also were helped by 10% discount for cash payments, and they made big profits. An absolute ridiculous bit of capitalism again with the Louisiana Purchase. French territory of Louisiana, which is this whole purple area down here, is sold to the Americans for just $15 million with 530 million acres, and that later on we get a smaller territory of Louisiana, but that's a huge purchase they've made there. And then we got the American pioneering spirit with Lewis and Clark, with the Corps of Discovery expedition. They failed to find their aimed river route to the Pacific, but the maps they used were used by fur traders, and eventually we see these maps lead to exploring further issues later on. We have to say at this point trade grew rapidly with very few problems until 1840. Right, here is the key issue of slavery. So slavery was being phased out in the northernmost states, but it continued in the southern states of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, because the population is growing in the north and the size of your population gives you votes, it was argued it was unfair to count the slaves as votes. The compromise was reached where each slave would count as 3/5 of a person, a population. Make that of what you will in terms of morals. Many in the north thought this was given into the southern slaveholders, so it gave them that extra little bit of sway. And again, here's the tension, the battle between democracy and getting one up on the opponents. So slavery was banned in these northwest territories, permitted in the southwest territories, and what we get then is immediately we see new cotton plantations open up in this area over here, the deep south, and because of that we get increased sales of slaves in these areas over here, the initial colonies. So much money is actually being made that they actually start kidnapping free black people from the north, take them to the south to make them slaves. That was how much profit could be made. Now, slavery is going to be part of this multi-billion-dollar industry of cotton, helped by the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, separating the cotton. You see it in the picture in the top right there, and increasingly plantation owners are using the pushing system, where you really push the slaves to pick at the speed of the fastest picker. The slavery really helps this area known as the Cotton Kingdom. So that's those southern slaves, those deep south states. We got New Orleans at the center of this, tripling in size. Cotton becomes 42% of all US exports, and slaves are brought in for the plantations. Now we've got an interesting issue, because morally in the north this is a problem. America's still expanding. What will happen to these new these new states. So what they get is the Missouri Compromise, and you can see Missouri marked on the map. And the Missouri Compromise says that slavery was allowed in Missouri itself and anything south of it. So you can see the dotted line along here. Whilst anything to the north and to the west of it wouldn't allow slavery. And what we now get is slavery is now added. States are now added with one slave state and one free state at a time. So Missouri is added at the same time as the free state of Maine, and that's the way of maintaining that balance. I said before about the dog-eat-dog world. We've got North versus South, each trying to get one up on each other. So this is a way of compromising. There is, however, an increased concern about slaves. There's rebellions at Saint-Dominique, part successful uprising in New Orleans by Charles Deslandes. But we got to remember, even in the north, there's a real fear of revolt and what would happen if all of a sudden these slaves won their right to vote. Main Northerners themselves are divided. Some want total ban of slavery, abolitionists. We got some who set up a colonization society so that free slaves could go to a home in Africa. Some helped slave revolts, and some were terrified and didn't know how to solve the issue. Now all this leaves out the fact we've got a terrible human story going on at this time. So you can see some horrible facts and figures there about children of slaves often separated, often without any family at all. Look at that figures there about the amount of children separated from their families, an average age of 9 years old. But money talks, capitalism talks, and even in the north, lots of money is being made by factories and land prospectors. And then you throw into the mix of the fact that the president was a southerner and a supporter of slavery, and he actually encouraged banks, including banks from Britain, by the way, to lend larger sums of money to invest even further in this industry, which grew a lot of money, but of course caused a lot of human misery. And of course there's the other human tragedy of the treatment of the Native Americans, the Indians in the East. So Northwest Territory is open to settlement, Southern Territory from 1790. A lot of those tribes that live there, what we're going to see happen is a lot of those tribes flee from the settlers and they go over towards the west. Now that's okay for those, but for the tribes in this southern area here, and I'll mark it on the big map in this area here, and we can see it in this area here, where they've got states been created around them, so they're trapped in with the Atlantic Ocean on the one side of them and white settlers on the other. So tribes like the Creeks and the Seminoles fought costly wars and often forced to give over territory. So they try a different way. So they try to adapt. So we got the Cherokees modeling the US system. We get a newspaper, we get the alphabet, we've got the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Seminoles. They open schools and churches, and they become what's known as the 5 civilized tribes. Now that sounds all very good, and what more can they do? But unfortunately this doesn't save their homelands. President Andrew Jackson, and I'll leave you to make up your own views on him personally. He passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, basically saying you sell your land or else. Under pressure, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks sign, and they start moving westwards to newly declared Indian Territory. Now they try to put up a little bit of a fight. So the Cherokees, they use various methods. The Cherokees take the state of Georgia to the Supreme Court. The judge there, Judge Marshall, says you're a distinct political society, but you're depending on the government who will act in your interest. President Jackson's furious about this. They haven't really given much away, but Jackson's furious and told the state government of Georgia to ignore the Supreme Court and to continue the settlement of Cherokee lands, ignoring one of the bodies that's supposed to provide safety and fairness. The Seminoles fight back, and after being defeated, the US forces capture and imprison Chief Osceola he was actually on the way to a peace meeting, and he's imprisoned. Again, there's that dog eat dog, we'll get one up on you type approach. A third war occurs, leaving the Seminole population at 200 in Florida, so that was hardly worth that. It's a Pyrrhic victory. which means a bit of a pointless one. They've not gained an awful lot. The Creeks tried to sign a treaty, try and see if they can make a bit of money. Land speculators basically take the mick, offer them tiny sums of money, and then squatters simply come in and take over their land. Creeks, understandably, are unhappy about this. They start stealing livestock and crops. Some do revert to murder and arson in revenge, and war is declared. And by 1837, that's not worked because 15,000 had to be moved westward. Cherokee, apart their leaders sign a treaty, but their whole population, almost the whole population, reject it. The US sees this as great ingratitude. 7,000 troops forced the 18,000 Cherokees into concentration camps, and then a atrocious 3-month winter march, which historians have estimated 4,000 to 5,000 Cherokees died in what became known as the Trail of Tears. So by 1838, the Jackson government, and that's not a real $20. He is on the $20, but that's a Mickey take of it. It's a Native American. They've removed 46,000 Indians from the land. They've made treaties, and they've opened up 25 million acres east of the Mississippi to white settlements and to slavery, at expense, of course, of the Native Americans. Okay, section 2, visions of the American West from 1839 to 1816. So the area between the two coasts, the east and the west, between the Mississippi and the west coast, really diverse, many different Native American tribes, each with its own culture and language. They had lived together, but we're peacefully, but we're now going to see a distinct change in this period. So we're going to focus on the Plains Indians to begin with. So we've got two major issues that change the way the Plains Indians have lived, from fairly stable trading existence, hunting buffalo on foot or farming. We've got two changes. So first of all, we got the horses brought in by the Spanish, and secondly, the guns brought by other Europeans to hunt the buffalo. Now we get the buffalo being hunted in very large numbers. Also, because of the pressure from the east and from the west, we get the Native Americans increasingly moving to the Great Plains and towards a more nomadic lifestyle. That trading that previously existed is being replaced by warfare. So let's take a look at a few of these examples of the Native Americans and how they changed. So starting off, I'm going to mark these on the map. We've got the Apache, who are based in the southern part of the plains. The Apache down here. So they originally hunted buffalo with bow and arrow, moved off the plains for harsh winters, and they traded. However, this all changed from the 1830s, where they became more nomadic, and they used horses and guns to hunt the buffalo. And instead of trading with the Navajo and the Pueblo Indians, they now steal their corn because it's a more effective way of living. So we've got a distinctive change there. Moving further north, and they're divided between the north and the south. Right in the middle here, we've got the northern Cheyenne and the southern Cheyenne. It's a very similar story from farming and hunting settlements. Now they move towards the more nomadic way with warfare. And we'll spend quite a bit of time on these as I focus the Lakota Sioux further north around the Black Hills of Dakota. Again, we've got horses, we've got guns, hunting a buffalo in large numbers. They expand rapidly, begin to live nomads, and they build their lives around the Black Hills of Dakota, as we can see marked on the map, which have got an important religious significance. So have a look further at the Lakota Sioux then. So the buffalo is, as we'll see with all Native Americans, absolutely vital, and that's going to be really important later on as the white settlers attack their use of the buffalo. So they're used for food, for clothing, for shelter. It was very ritualistic with the buffalo dance which lasted several days before a hunting spree. Now that we can get we can't get into our heads that they were perfect at this. They often killed many more buffaloes than needed. We've got a horrible story here of one hunting party bringing back 1,400 buffalo tongues, leaving their bodies to rot on the plain. So we can't say it's everything was perfect, but it's still, compared to the numbers we see of buffalo killed later on, it's still small. More signs of the importance of the buffalo is that the teepee is made from buffalo hides, stretched over the wooden poles, easily taken up and down. Conical shape saves them from the wind and allows the smoke to blow from the fire within it. Men's jobs largely hunting and fighting, looking after the horses. The women responsible for the food, making items made from buffalo, looking after the teepee. Located children very valued, but that large part of their lives was preparing for adulthood. And old people were seen as given great wisdom, but were left behind when they could no longer keep up. So there's a great idea here in the importance of nature, in the belief in a great spirit, Wakantanka, that everything has a spirit, rocks, streams, trees, and of course is going to be important when they come up against the whites who fence off their land and who damage it through mining as well. Land, important part of spirituality, everything came from land, everything returned to land, and contrary to their previous beliefs, the idea that farming was disrespectful. For Lakota Sioux, the Black Hills were sacred land with many buried there. As we saw, they became increasingly militaristic and aggressive, using the horse and gun to defeat their fierce rivals, the Crow and the Mandan. And by the 1830s, the Lakota were the dominant tribe in their area of the plains. Lakota boys learned to ride. There was rival warrior societies. They gained honor from stealing from each other. And although women generally weren't allowed to fight, there are some exceptions, Buffalo Calf Road being one of them. So what we're going to see now is clashes with the other groups here. So the early migrants, so why did they travel in the first place? Well, there was a downturn in the economy, so many of them were looking for a better life, looking for areas perfect for farming, and stories of the West led to that. In places like Oregon, we had the Preemption Act of 1841, which gave the farmers, settlers, the chance to buy the surrounding land once they'd settled down. Now, there was a lot of work that went into it, but it meant that the rewards were great. Increasingly, journalists are talking about the idea of manifest destiny, that it was God's plan, their destiny, their right to settle the land and convert the Indians to Christianity. And the maps previously used by mountain men helped to make the settling a simpler process. So it's a very tough journey. First of all, any migrants would have to make this way to one of the towns at the edge of the plains, presumably by railroad. If they were making this journey, it's a tough start even from the very beginning. So winter in one of the towns, such as Independence, we can see marked on the map just here. They would build their own wagons, loads of supplies would be bought, and then when the better weather came in the spring, they'd set off, often travelling in a chain of wagons looking for safety. So they'd go along this Platte River, where they would be looking for their first idea of how difficult this journey was going to be. Baking hot sun, torrential rain, slow progress, only 18 miles a day. And as they went off they would have to jettison many of their possessions because they realised that they were next to useless from what they originally thought. And then they've got to cross the Rocky Mountains, awful journeys going across here, many accidents, many dying of disease, many caught by snow. And then eventually they reach Fort Hall, where they would have the choice of taking the northern route to Oregon or the southern route to California. And even then, even if they made that journey over to the west, over to Oregon, up here, or to California further south, then they still faced the difficulty of starting a new life, and we'll look at that later on. So 2,400-mile journey, 8 months to complete. Very difficult. Interestingly, although the image you'll often see in films is of white settlers, over a quarter of the population were foreign born, and 3,000 black Americans made this journey as well. Or despite the story and despite the films showing Native Americans, Indian attacks, the most common cause of death was disease. Wasn't long, of course, until they came into conflict with Native Americans. Senator Douglas declaring that the Indian barrier must be removed. And then at 1851 at Fort Laramie, tribes such as the Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the Crow gave the USA rights to establish forts and safe routes. Similar sort of story in the southern tribes of Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, also establishing these rights. Part of these rights, however, was to do with giving them time to settle, and the fact that they would granted them US forts, but they would have some time before settlers would come into it, so a guarantee of safety. However, as we can see at the bottom there, 1855 treaty with the Yakima, immediately settlers moved into there despite the 2-year guidance. And not surprisingly, we got conflict. The Yakima started raiding white settlements. The armies called in, and they lost 90% of their land. 24 of their chiefs hanged or shot. So third group, only a short one. The Mormons were a religious group inspired by Joseph Smith's 1830 Book of Mormon. They believed that they could rebuild Jesus' church in America. They attracted large numbers and also large numbers of opposition. Their belief in a shared land and property ownership, lots of people didn't agree with that. Smith himself had a godlike status. They opposed slavery. Their practice of polygamy taken to extremes by their later leader, Brigham Young, who had 55 wives. Polygamy is the practice of being able to marry multiple times. Nevertheless, after Smith's death, they under Young's leadership, they head to what they saw as God Kingdoms, traveling 1,300 miles on foot to Salt Lake City, and setting up their own conurbation there, their own safety there, their own sanctuary there at Salt Lake City, as you can see marked on the map, which had a population of over 10,000. Now, it was largely successful because Young very carefully planned the economy. He controlled land, he gave what each family needed, and he organised irrigation so the water was shared in these different circumstances, so everyone got their share. 1848, USA took land from Mexico and the area became the territory of Utah, and Young became the first governor. However, all this was wasted. In 1857, we have troops going over to make sure that they followed US laws, and then a dispute and accusations of being spied upon lead to some Mormons murdering some settlers, and scandal meant that Young stepped down as governor. Gold would change everything in this area. So we have gold discovered in Sierra Nevada, near to California, leading to the Friends of 1849. Wild stories of men making $1,000 a day, with an average wage only be $2 to $3. 50,000 Americans, thousands from Europe, Mexico, traveled to the area. We also have many people making money from the miners, providing pans, picks, tents, blankets, and food. $100 for a new miner. That would be the average cost that they would expect. Some men like Levi Strauss, famous for his jeans, made money initially from this. Now, initially the work was easy. It was surface gold they were looking for, but that by 1852 that had gone, and they started digging out tons of quartz crystal. They created these giant stamp mills, and then they had to go into chemical vats to release the gold. So it becomes more of a science. It becomes more industrial. By 1852, 108 crushing mills dominated the California gold scene. California itself becoming a state in 1850 as a result, with its port of San Francisco becoming a major city. Lumbering starts gathering wood, and farming spread across California for the new town. So it's not only the gold mines themselves, but it also had knock-on effects. Native Americans were initially welcome, but very quickly that changed to hostility. 1850s law, any Indian who could prove he had a job would be arrested and sold to white settlers. Who couldn't prove that they had a job. And if anyone if they were gold mining and couldn't prove they were working elsewhere, they could be sold as slave labour. Hundreds were captured and sold in this way. We have at times whole hillsides being washed away with these high-powered water jets. That causes other problems with flooding. Massive issues for Native Americans. Damage from the chemicals killed the fish and wildlife. Remember their beliefs about the wildlife, about nature. We have a second gold rush in 1858 to 59 in Pikes Peak. Again, we get gold prospectors gaining government protection, gold fever spreading, 100,000 people, many people heading this way. This time they've got the train lines, means that double the amount are able to go than they had gone to California. And each town promotes itself as the safest way to get there and having an easy route. And that helps the town, but also inspired them more and more people to go. Farming grows because you can't just have gold, you've got to have food provided for them. So Kansas becomes a state in 1861, the western half's named Colorado Territory, and what we're seeing now is what was seen as a journey, what was seen as a crossing, a road, is now seen as a destination. People are heading to the plains, not to cross to the west, but to stay there, to gold mine and to stay in the towns. And that's inevitably going to cause issues. So we have cities like Denver were growing in regions with the Arapaho and the Southern Cheyenne were living, meaning that they had to further travel to their hunting lines, and that brings them in conflict with other Native Americans and other whites. Cheyenne and the Arapaho met the US authorities at Fort Laramie saying, we wish to live. They wish to have a way of life, but it looks as if increasingly the US government becomes convinced they're going to have to deal with this Native American threat, and we're going to see that coming up. Okay, section 3 then. So we're going to now focus on this topsy-turvy battle between the North and the South to deal with slavery. And this is quite a complicated era, and I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So we already had right at the beginning, there's a big difference between North and South. We have in the North, it's more capitalist, it's more urbanized. There's a mixed economy, meaning there's many different ways of earning money. South is much more semi-modern plantation, so it's largely farming based. So because of that, a lot of the plantations rely on slavery, and that's what's going to cause a major issue here. So what we see is 7 slaveholding states led by South Carolina eventually seceded. They removed themselves from the Union, and we get a civil war. At the end of the war, Lincoln states that actually this is all to do with slavery, but that's an oversimplification. We've got to get into our heads that slavery, though based in the South, very much affected the North as well. 3.2 million slaves by 1850, 1.3 billion was their worth, and it really is the economic glue which hangs together the North and the South, with northern businesses prospering and work provided for US citizens in the North on the back of the money made from slavery. There is, however, a clear move, moral move, led in the North about attacking slavery. We got abolitionists growing in strength, and they'd grown in strength for a number of reasons. We got the National Anti-Slavery Society, 1833, with 250,000 members by 1838. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, gave lectures. He and Harriet Tubman assisted thousands to escape via the Underground Railroad. And then in 1851, got a very famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. 2 million copies sold in 10 years, really focusing on the horrors of slavery. Population grows in the North, and because population is linked to votes, the South's position was losing political power because of the focus on a state's power being governed by its size. 1846, as a result of this, the Congress said that slavery should be banned in the new territories which had recently been gained from Mexico, and that's gonna be a negative for the South. So if we draw a line in the middle here, and if we go upwards, that's a gain towards those who are opposed to slavery. At the moment, we've got a slight gain because we're saying that slavery is being banned in those early anything gained from Mexico. Right, now the South tried to start fight back, and in 1850 we got the Henry Clay Compromise that Washington will be slave free and Utah will be allowed to decide themselves. Sorry, California and Washington should be free, but the new territories like New Mexico and Utah should be allowed to decide for themselves. That goes against the previous agreements. Meanwhile, they also managed to pass the idea that there would be a Fugitive Slave Act, which says that if slaves have been found, escaped slaves, even the North, then the North had a duty to return them. So we now have also a further, in 1854, the Missouri Compromise, remember, said that slavery wouldn't go any further south. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act went against this, allowing the two states of Kansas and Nebraska to choose if they wanted slavery by popular vote. Now that's a major decision. So we've got the previous one going further to the anti-slavery, and now we're having a move towards the pro-slavery because of this choice. Both sides throw their settlers into the area, trying to influence the vote, trying to make sure the vote goes their way. Massive, awful violence known as Bleeding Kansas. And the violence even continues into politics. It's a bit later on in this, but 1865, two Southern senators beat a Northern senator unconscious on the floor of the Senate over this issue. So over this issue of where slavery goes. So we get a fight back from the South. Realizing this, as a result, the party that's got control at the moment is the Democratic Party. Might go against what our current beliefs are, but that's the way it was. The Democratic Party supported agriculture. Many people will think it's going too far to support the Southern slaveholders. We now have the Republican Party set up as a direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act to try to halt the power of these Southern slavers. And they get great support from abolitionists. We get a Democrat, James Buchanan, become president and openly supported the idea of slavery north of the Missouri Compromise. So at the same time, the Republicans Party is fighting, even further swayed by the Democrats. And he supports a controversial Supreme Court judgment saying that the Dred Scott decision, which said Congress had no right to ban slavery. So it's saying that states have got the power to keep slavery going. So if anything, we got the focus on the Southern, of those who wanted to maintain slavery. Now we have a change. So we now have a new presidential candidate, a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, who is a champion for hard-working Americans and wants to stop the power of the Southern slavers. Now we get the descent into the Civil War. So the state government of South Carolina voted 169 to 0 to secede. Then further 6 states join. Then we get the Confederacy led by slaveholder Jefferson Davis, saying that they were testing the powers of the president. Lincoln becomes president in 1861. He states that it's illegal for the South and that all foughts with the property. And then we get the first shots of the Civil War when the Confederacy opened fire and fought Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and war has begun. So the president's restored the equilibrium, but that equilibrium is really now being tested. We got a level Civil War. That's where we've got to. It's so tight, so even is the match between the two. Now, in the early stages, we have to remember that life continued as normal. So in the North, African Americans, though free, have lived in the worst areas of the worst jobs with the worst money, and they're very much segregated. In the South, most Black Americans were slaves. They were cramped, lived in cramped cabins. There was disease. They couldn't read or write. That was illegal. And right at the beginning, slavery continues in the North, in the South, and the slave states, including the slave states that decided to support the North. So it's Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and the western half of Virginia. So remember, there are some states who are slave states which are supporting the North. Now that's important because in the early years of the war, there's a rush of black volunteers to the Union Army, but Lincoln didn't change this because he didn't want to lose those border states. We get a little bit of the first fight back. In 1862, we get a law saying that captured slaves could be held legally as contraband as war. The South disputes that, but the North say, yep, we've beaten you, they're your property, we can take them as part of our taking of your property, and therefore it's allowed. In 1862, we get the Second Confiscation Act, which meaning slave holding land automatically becomes free. So the North's winning this war, and they're taking the land back. So in the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, 10,000 slaves are freed and form a new town called Mitchellville. So we get at the moment the North winning the Civil War and taking land off the South. Right, phase two, total war. So that was the first stage is Lincoln's quite conservative about these changes. On the 1st of January 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation says slaves will be freed at the end of the war. So that's the first time it's openly stated that. We get the first South Carolina volunteers formed from free slaves fighting in the South, and then in the North, a 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment fighting again in the North. 70% of Northern black men joined the Union Army. However, to begin with, they're not treated equally whatsoever. They haven't got equal pay, and the ban on black officers continued. They had to actually go for disobedience to get equal pay. Women are taking part in the Civil War. Harriet Tubman, we mentioned her earlier, as a scout and a spy, and Susie King Taylor as a battlefield nurse and taught poor white soldiers to read and write. So as the war was being fought and being won by the North, they sent out missionaries. They help freed men, previous slaves, to read and write. They also employed the freed slave to work as paid labourers. However, money's not very much, barely enough to feed and clothe them. And although they aren't allowed to be whipped, they aren't allowed to leave these plantations. So very little has really changed. Final few months of the war, however, General Sherman cut through Confederate forces, and to win over the freed slaves, each one is promised 40 acres of land and a mule to be taken from the slaveholder property. They also agreed to rent small farms to freed slaves. Investigations during this time period show that of the 113,000 freemen in Mississippi and Arkansas, over half were entirely self-supporting. So there's a real positive here at the moment that these slaves will be able to look after themselves. However, in contrast to that, up in the North, already we've got problems. In New York City, poor white citizens being forced to join the war take out their anger on black citizens in the area. 4 days of violence where they drowned or lynched black citizens. Right, so the war is won by the North in 1865. 250,000 Americans lie dead. 18 out of every 100 Confederate soldiers don't return, as opposed to 6 out of 100 Union soldiers in the North. And now we get this Reconstruction. Now, things could have been very, very different. The 13th Amendment to ban slavery, and on the 4th of March 1865, Lincoln began his second term. However, who knows what would have happened if he'd have lived? But he's shot dead watching a play in Ford's Theatre by John Wilkes Booth, who said he did it to put a stop to nigger citizenship. So any chance that that Civil War was going to be used to bring forward a wholesale change, a positive change for freed slaves, now looks like it's, well, things will have to wait. And that's very much how it looks. Remember, they've just fought for years over this issue of slavery. President Andrew Johnson, the former vice president, seems to throw this all away. He says that Confederate states, those southern states, could immediately regain their power. They could re-establish their state governments. He gave the land back to slave owners, including those sea islands we looked at earlier, and only 2,000 of the black families held onto their land. And then, in December of that year, Reconstruction is declared finished. On top of that, although enslaving is banned, so we can't go back to slaving, we get these black codes limiting the rights of the black workers, stopping them from serving on juries. We get African Americans not allowed to rent or own their own farmland, and the Ku Klux Klan's formed. So if we draw this line again, and we say that during the Civil War, the 13th Amendment and the changes, the promises of Abraham Lincoln are given great promise, and we say that up to there, that now has been a long way brought back. There've been a slight change, there's been slight improvements, but this Reconstruction period really is not going to get the success that people initially thought it was going to do. But now we get a fight back with what's known as radical Reconstruction. So we got the president really slowing up, but now we get anti-slave Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner challenging the president, saying that actually no, they've got to be run like territories. So there's problems in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau, which gave plantation land to slaves and helped give them healthcare and education, got no money left. There's nothing left there. So they go on the attack. They twice override the veto by the president. That's the president's ability to try and stop it. And the Congress gets approved the 14th Amendment in 1850. 1866, which says that everyone needs to be treated equally and regardless of their race. This is a huge majority in the elections had also been gained to back this up. And in 1867, they got the rights for black men in Washington to vote for the first time, and southern states would follow. So if we update our issue on this, we said due to the president that they'd only made a slight improvement. We've now got this with this 14th Amendment. We've now got this taking a step further up towards this way, so that we've now got a further improvement. They also say that there's 3 Reconstruction Acts. Basically, they said this is a nonsense that these southern states have had this power. So they established 5 military districts in the south. Army officers had to ensure black rights were protected. All voters' rights were registered, and the Confederate States had to write their own new constitutions, which allowed black Americans to vote and to agree the 13th and 14th Amendments before they were allowed to give them. So it's taken all that power that those southern states immediately gained straight after Lincoln's death, but it's really reduced it again. Now, major steps forward here. 2,000 black Americans were elected to political posts. The 14th Amendment became law, which overturns the Dred Scott case, which said that the federal government could intervene. And then Andrew Johnson loses the presidential election to the ex-Union General Ulysses S. Grant. And we get the 15th Amendment being accepted, which says that every US citizen has the right to vote to prevent black Americans, freed Americans being able to vote. So if we draw a line again, we've now, under radical Reconstruction, we've now got a significant stage forward for those believing that the freed slaves should have their rights. And then we get a reverse. Reconstruction loses its way. Many in the South believe that if you give the 15th Amendment, if you give the vote to illiterate African Americans, you're going to lead to ruin because they won't know what they're voting for. Southern states, despite these changes, however, are still dominated by white voters because ex-slaves didn't meet the property qualifications. Many of those leading Republicans we just saw who had led the way die, and the Republicans lose their majority in the 1874 elections. It's the Reconstruction project slowed by 1870. Freeman's Bureau is closed, and sadly we now get the power coming back to groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. And what they do is they target black citizens and voters, and slowly they stop any political power that they had. Many black families are little better than slaves now. They're sharecroppers. They live on land owned by the whites, often the former plantation owners. They have to give them 2/3 of their crops each year, which gives them more power. And basically, they're free, but they're little more than slaves. Ulysses Grant, the great hope, the general who had won, promised assistance but didn't do anything because his focus is on the failing economy. Just when you think things can't get any worse, the Supreme Court, the body that's supposed to ensure equality between the two sides and make sure things are balanced, says that although voters are to be treated equally in the national elections, at state elections that doesn't have to be the case. This opens the door to segregation in the South, separate schools, parks, restaurants. The Supreme Court then says in 1875 that the Constitution means that the government doesn't have the power to intervene if black voters were stopped from voting, which seems difficult to understand. Politics becomes dominated by ex-Confederate officers in the South, and they're elected by white voters, largely because black voters are too scared to vote because of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Soldiers are withdrawn in 1877. The White League and the Ku Klux Klan dominate, and most of the rest of the country now look towards the West. So these gains that have been, we started up here, and now we're seeing, yep, they're not slaves, they're free, but they're not an awful lot better. So the line is just above where we started in my interpretation of this. We do have a situation really where, despite the bloodshed of the American Civil War, very little seems to have been gained. Okay, section 4. Settlements, we're back to the Native Americans and that conflict that we saw building previously in section 2, settlement and conflict on the plains. The nice draw in this, we got a variety of different things. We got the settlement of the white towns trying to build up. We get in the distance here wagon trains as further people go to settle. We got the great expanse of this whole area here, showing the promise that was potentially available. We get the trains which bring these new settlers into these areas, and choking on the smoke of the trains, we get the Native Americans suffering as the West is colonized. So just to be clear, it's a painting by F. Palmer on the right there, and you saw on the previous slide. Railroad is going to be absolutely huge in changing the plain. Now, of course, the American government had realised that there are settlements in the east, there are settlements in the west, but there's very little to connect them. And we saw the really difficult journey that Western settlers had to make going across the country. So the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 gives government land and money to companies willing to build this transcontinental railroad. $50 million have been made available in 1964. 6,400 acres are granted for every mile of track built, because we're talking about absolutely huge amounts of land here. And in 1869, the first transcontinental railway was built by two companies who met in the middle of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific companies. Thousands of workers are needed. 12,000 Chinese migrants were employed by the Central Pacific Company to tunnel through the mountain range of the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountains. Awful conditions in the heat and the freezing snow of winter. Terrible sanitation. But you know, the drive towards the money that was at the end of this meant that the companies made the money and the workers were exploited and suffered. Well, the railroads divide the Indian lands from north and south, so we know that's going to be a problem, and it's where the buffalo had previously roamed. There's a change here, though, also because after the Civil War, great herds of cattle have been found. 1866, Charles Goodnight, Oliver Loving drive 2,000 cattle to plains markets and make $24,000 from that, and now that becomes a common thing to do. It's realised there's an awful lot of money available in this drive to get this cattle. We get in 1867 we get the first cow town of Abilene in Kansas, and it's advertised as a place to bring cattle to the railways for sale in the north and east. And there was disorder in these towns initially, as often you see in westerns. But very soon sheriffs are introduced, and it doesn't last long. You can imagine the cowboys then going in from a long drive and want to have a bit of fun and partying, and the conflict that would come from that. Cowboys, despite their image, were often very small because they needed to stay on a horse. Mostly poor young men. About a third were Mexicans or Indians or ex-slaves hoping for money. We get a change because that only lasts about 20 years. Those drives. John Iliffe changed this. He says, let's keep the animals on the plains to be closer to the cattle towns, and open cattle ranching had spread throughout the Central Plains. Now this causes problems for anyone trying to live in the plains because there's a scarcity of water and grass for the buffalo herds, and the Indians are at a risk of starvation. Okay, yes, that's cattle ranchers. Homesteaders are another group of people who were willing to take on these awful conditions. 1860s and 70s, 500,000 homesteaders moved just to one of the states. That's just to Kansas. Why are they doing it? Well, California and Oregon, though attractive, are quite relatively expensive places to go to. There's cheap prices compared to those new states. The government also encouraged people to do it with the Homestead Act of 1862. If you farmed your 160 acres for 5 years and paid a small fee, then you would get that land. And we have an issue here where women were also able to exploit this. Up to 50% of all homesteaders were owned by women. And railroad companies who set up the railroad, well, they had an incentive to get people to go to these areas and to buy into this idea. So they had a huge advertising campaign encouraging people to come over and to use the railroads to go and build their homesteads. Awful problems for these homesteaders. because wood's in short supply, they make their houses called soddies out of earth and grass roots. But this obviously is a lack of cleanliness. There's diseases such as cholera become common. There's a lack of water. They have this thing called dry farming, where basically whenever it rains, you plough it to trap in the water, and they use Turkey red wheat from Russia, which could withstand the frost and therefore was a more hardy crop to grow. Even if they were successful in establishing the homestead, they're often very, very isolated, miles away from their nearest neighbours. The tough roots of the grass broke the ploughs. The soddies often leaked. There was no wood. They had to burn dried buffalo or cow droppings to keep themselves warm. And then, ironically, in the summer, in the hot summer months, fire was a problem, and we had locust swarms. 1874 to 1877. They had to try to stop the roaming cattle from trampling the crops, although that was improved with the invention of barbed wire in 1874, which pretty much sets out these areas into little kingdoms of their own, separating each farmland but causing more problems for the Native Americans. Not surprisingly, all these people coming into the plains causes a major issue. Rivalry between different tribes and the settlers. The issue is that many of the tribes are being sent to land reservations where they had to rely on the government to feed themselves or had to turn to farming. And that's a major change for the Native Americans, and many just refuse to do it. And conflict has increased by the fact we've got civil war, meant that over a third of each household owns at least one gun. A series of different disputes now. In each one, there's a dispute over land. There's often something to do with the reservation. There's individuals who cause problems, and there's the seeking of violence and revenge. So Little Crow's War of 1861 to 62. The Sante Sioux had all given up 28 million acres of land for small reservations in South Minnesota and faced starvation. But the agent in charge of their reservation refused them food. So the Sioux, desperately needing that food, attacked farms and towns, and 500 settlers were slaughtered by Little Crow's followers. Minnesota soldiers fought back. Little Crow was killed, and when they did so, they took their heads and their scalps were publicly displayed. 38 Sante Sioux were hanged, hundreds were imprisoned, and others were taken to the reservations in Dakota Territory. Some settlers thought that the Sioux had got off lightly. Now, I mentioned earlier the gold at Pikes Peak, with the Cheyenne and the other Arapaho being sent onto a small reservation. One of those reservations near Sand Creek led to great suffering, and that led to many of those Native Americans raiding settlers. There's a series of disputes between the local army and the settlers, and one particular unit, the 3rd Colorado Volunteers, led by Reverend John Chivington, were mocked because they'd not seen action, they'd not done anything. They were called the Bloodless Third. So when a settler is killed, these troops, looking to prove themselves, march onto the Sand Creek reservation. They kill 105 Cheyenne women and children and 28 men. They put on display their scalps and their genitalia as trophies. A government investigation sees Chivington and his men arrested, and Chivington's forced to resign from the army. But it really is a story of, well, it's a massacre, as the title suggests. It's a massacre. Further issues with gold. The Bosman Trail ran through the Lakota Sioux hunting ground. Now that was used by gold prospectors, and it was banned as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty. However, gold moves mountains, and gold prospectors kept going through it. So in 1866, Red Cloud and other Lakota leaders, such as Crazy Horse, attacked the US forts. They lured out 80 men and killed them and mutilated those men. And they actually have a series of victories, 1867 to 1868. And the government guarantees that US troops and settlers will not enter a vast area around the Black Hills of Dakota. So it looks like there's been a victory. It doesn't last long. There's rumours of new gold in the Black Hills of Dakota. Tens of thousands of miners enter the Sioux lands causing huge problems. The government do offer them $6 million for the Black Hills, and one of the leaders, Ray Cloud, agreed to it. However, other leaders don't agree to it, and that causes huge problems. President Grant's furious because he believes he's got a deal. Sioux and the other allies are forced into reservation, and then after a vision comes to them, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse set up their own camp on the banks of the Little Big Horn River. So this is the famous incident, one of the most famous incidents of this whole sad campaign. General Custer, in 1876, surrounds the 6,000 Indians, of which 1,800 are warriors, with 210 cavalrymen. But he's outnumbered 4-1 and is defeated. It's a great victory for the Native Americans, but it doesn't last because the US Army prevents the warriors from getting their daily supply of food, and they kept them on the run. The US hunt down all the Sioux bands. Crazy Horse is arrested and killed in 1877. Sitting Bull flee to Canada with a small band of warriors, but the remaining Sioux in America have to surrender. The US take the Black Hills of Dakota and a further 40 million acres of Indian land. They'd won a battle, but they were clearly losing the war. So we move now on to our final section, having a look at the combination of this period, really, of how American lives changed in 1877 to 1900, and I'm afraid to say we're going to see some very negative views of the journey that we've seen so far. So we start with the sad story, really, of the Native Americans. So we know that after the Battle of Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull and his followers have fled. They're forced to return in 1881, and they come back to the Standing Rock Reservation, reunited with the rest of the Sioux. And this really is the story of all the reservations of this period. There's a real inadequate level of medical and food supplies, but they've got no choice. There's no real chance of living on the plains. And part of that is because the slaughter of the buffalo, which of course has been so central to Native American culture. So awful figures there of 16 million kilos of buffalo bone just for fertilizer, 3 million buffalo killed by the hunters. And by 1883, the vast herds of the 1840s had all but gone in a very short period of time, further worsened by the plains being shut off because homesteaders fenced their water supplies, and big factories picked wild food such as berries. So again, there wasn't a usable food supplies on the plains for the Native Americans. The government from the 1870s had a very deliberate policy of splitting up the tribes and the reservations. Quote there from Angel Gabraith, to break up the tribal system to make white men of them. So the Sioux were divided over different reservations. The Southern Cheyenne and the Arapaho were made to share. The Indians are made to become farmers. They're not allowed to hunt outside the reservations, and that leads to many of the Indians relying on government beef rations. Hunger and disease, as a consequence, ravished their lives. Several deliberate strategies were used by the government for destroying Native American culture. The Indian tribes on the reservations had to mirror the government ones, the US government ones, and they can't even control their own courts. They had to live in houses rather than teepees, which is not so significant because actually there's not the buffalo skins available anyway. They had to convert to Christianity, and again, the lack of buffalo means continuing their traditional beliefs were impossible. Children were sent to boarding schools. English became their first language. They were dressed in Victorian-style costumes. They were taught how Indian beliefs and practices were backwards and outdated, and they focused on the savagery of previous Native American attacks. Meanwhile, Indian children had to change their names. So it's a real attempt to wipe out history. The ironically titled Friends of the Indians was formed in 1883. This was to encourage the Indians to become Christian, and they were a major part of making the government push for this 1877 Dawes Plan, which on the face of it sounds nice. Indians were offered 160 acres of land and full US citizenship, but in doing so they had to give up their right to the land as a tribe, and again that destroyed the whole tribe culture. So millions of acres of land is lost. There's a fact there of in the Oklahoma land rush, 1.9 million acres of land sold in a single day. By 1900, nearly 2/3 of the land Indians had held had been taken. So there's a mini fight back here, not much of one to be honest. The 1890s, we got a new religion to the ghost dance. It's basically a prayer and a dance, hoping for a savior to return the buffalo and sweep the whites from the land. There was rumours that Sitting Bull was involved in it. The US Army went to arrest the ghost dancers, and in the process, the Sioux police shot and killed Sitting Bull. The remaining ghost dancers were chased down by General Miles, and they located them at Wounded Knee, where the army used cannons and machine guns. There's a rumour of a gun going off by accident and that causing chaos, and that led to the deaths of 250 men, women and children, with the ghost dancers surrendering the following New Year. So much for the Native Americans. Let's have a look at African Americans. Would they fare any better? Well, scarily, for those who had campaigned so hard for equality, by this period, many people were almost wiping the Civil War out of history as a period that should be totally forgotten. In the South, recovery is slow. We got these awful conditions on the sharecroppers, rather, which make them little better than slaves, really. And there is some attempt to get out of there, attempts to go to the west. We get the Exodusters going to Kansas, 6,000 there in 1879, with 15,000 black citizens. It's not great in the north still. Black Americans were seen as competition for jobs. There was poor housing, they didn't have much pay. They sometimes used black labourers to break strikes. There's some attempts to improve the life for black Americans. Booker T. Washington set up to the school. It's a difficult one, this, because the school focused on practical skills, which some say he was lowering the standards for African Americans. But he also sets up the National Negro Business League, and as a result, there's black businesses are supported. 24,000 black teachers, 400 doctors, 300 black lawyers. Meanwhile, in the South, the Jim Crow laws mean separation on train, schools, restaurants, churches, parks. Almost all the time, these facilities for African Americans are inferior, but they're allowed to stay on the principle of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling, which said separate but equal. As long as they were equal, that they would be allowed to continue. However, that was very seldom the case. So we do get a few success stories with 26 black bishops and black churches being very popular, but that really is the tip of the iceberg, because in the north, black workers lived in 90% black areas with poor housing. Got some steps forward in terms of education, something of an elite being produced, most famous of which is William Du Bois. He got degrees from Harvard and from Berlin. There's African Americans who flourish as musicians and writers and artists, but again, they still face the same sort of discrimination. And meanwhile, in the South, these redeemer governments, controlled by former slaveholders, do everything to keep the African Americans at power. So we get the literacy test being brought in. An example of this in Louisiana, we go from 130,000 blacks registered to vote in 1896. By 1905, through intimidation, that's only 1,300 are actually still in existence, and that's largely because of organisations like the Ku Klux Klan, who were secretly reformed in the 1890s and intimidated black voters and anyone willing to push black votes. And in 1892, a horrible example, we have 161 black citizens being tortured and lynched in 1 year, one single year alone. So businesses. How did businesses prosper? Well, in short, businesses prospered very well, workers not so much. Well, we get a growth here of corporations. So they are run by a president and board shareholders rather than a single person or a family. So 5,000 manufacturing firms are absorbed by only 334 corporations. Workers do try to go on to strike, and two famous ones there. 1892, Carnegie's home steel strike saw 7 workers killed, and the Pullman Railroad Car Company cutting wages let lots of people go on strike. And then the president actually sends troops to go and stop the strike. Again, we got 26 workers shot, leaders arrested and blacklisted, meaning they couldn't get work in the future. In the South, cotton mills doubled. We get increased tobacco and cigarette production. One company, American Tobacco Company, controls 90% of cigarettes, 75% of tobacco production. the jobs are almost always low skilled and poorly paid. So the companies are making lots of money, not so good for the average worker. Similar sort of story with mines. So the government passed a law allowing them to be set up for little costs, massive increase in coal production, huge ecological damage with chemicals leaking into the water supply, workers, very little protection, no breathing equipment, many died of lung disease. And even in the cattle farm, which have been so successful, now we have bonanza farms, which are large businesses with managers, with the average farm 10,000 acres in size. So, the little family farms died out. 250 workers on low wages yet again. Falling beef prices, harsh winter means that they could take over even more businesses. Companies doing well, little man not doing so well. In the cities, we got a huge growth in cities. Chicago is one great example, growing to 1.5 million by 1900. Only been a tiny town of 200 people 70 something years earlier. We get a huge increase in towns over 100,000, 14 in 1870, by 1900, 30 years later, that's 38. We get the elevator, we get the skyscraper, but for the average worker, for the average person working in these cities, often it's poorly designed, it's overcrowded departments, there's little privacy, there's poor sanitation, and a frightening statistic there in Chicago where one neighborhood where nearly 60% of all babies die before their first birthday. There's some positives, there's theaters and there's Wild West shows, there's public parks, there's dozens of newspapers to choose from. 70% are going to school, women look to gain increasing freedom. So there's some positives in there, but for the average worker, life would have been very tough. And then you add into the fact that many people are attracted to come to America, buoyed by the idea of freedom and stability. Look at that, over 500,000 come from Italy alone in the 1890s. The government opened up an emigration station in Ellis Island in New York. They often, if they got through that, and 10% were deemed too unwell to even make that through, they often face discrimination and anti-immigration violence. In 1887, we have the fear of immigrants is shown with the American Protective Association set up to protect Protestant Americans from Catholics, Jewish and Buddhist immigrants. One of the groups that's most persecuted are Chinese immigrants, and we get the so-called Chinese riots. Chinese made up 10% of San Francisco, but were only allowed to live within Chinatown. So they were restricted within that area. And then in 1882, fed up with the amount of Chinese who were coming in, despite the fact that they contributed so much to the economy. If you remember, they were a large part responsible for the building of the railroads. We have the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, limiting the amount of Chinese workers entering into America. So that concludes this period of time. And I'll repeat what I said before. I think this is quite a sad period of time. Good for businesses, good for the big people, but we have persecution of Native Americans, persecution of African Americans, and very little success there, but bar a few elite. And although the corporations make money, the workers are very poorly off, and immigrants face a very difficult time. And we'll just finish now with just a recap of the exam questions that you can expect to face. It actually follows a very similar, the same mark scheme as the crime and punishment mark scheme. So you get at the very beginning of the paper these single point questions, simple knowledge questions. You just need often just one word or 2 words to answer them. And then we have a organised account. As with crime and punishment, you really need to organise this carefully. You need to plan your answer. We have a question here on the impact of the Californian gold rush. It's going to be a focus. There's going to need a focus again on planning this answer. There's going to be multiple issues you're going to be talking about. You need to plan it well. Second order concept. So we're looking at complexity, that it's not as simple as one impact. There's multiple impacts, and you might prioritize those impacts or show how that impact changed over time. And then we finish with the 2 essay style questions. You got a choice out of 2 and you choose one of them. Again, absolutely vital that you take your time, you plan your answer, you leave enough time for it. It's a 2-sided argument, very short introduction to introduce it for the highest marks, and a complex conclusion, which shows a sophisticated understanding. And again, we've got that complex thinking here.